Welcome everybody to Cook Sandwiched In, our second one for the spring 2023. Today, Jim Hare will be reviewing the book Lincoln's Final Hours by Kathryn Canavan. Jim's a former teacher of American history and government and former mayor and also city councilman.
I'm lucky not to be former.
He writes a monthly column for the Star Gazette on the history of Elmira and has co-published with Diane Janowski 6 books entitled True Stories about the history of Elmira, and 1 book with the late county historian J. Arthur Kiefer entitled Images of Elmira. So without delay, Jim?
Well, it's great to be here, and I'm in the honored company first of the county historian from Schuyler County, Gary Emerson, who will be speaking to you next week, and George Farr, you were the town historian in Elmira, right?
Yes.
And then, and with that, there's a couple of things I want to comment on. First of all, George is about to have published a book on Lincoln's Banner Regiment. This is the cover, right? This is the cover, and it's by George. It's the 107th New York Volunteer Infantry, which was our local company, and this is should be.
That's the statue on Lake Street.
That's the statue on Lake Street, and it's coming out, we hope, in May, but. And Gary is working on his PhD with regard to the Elmira prison camp and so on, so we have a lot of local scholarship going on here, and of course, that's what Book Sandwiched In is about. It's scholarship and writing and so on, and the ladies that have organized this, and can't you hear me? No. And the ladies that have organized this and have founded it, it just is wonderful, and the library hosting it, I think, is terrific. So, with that, I want to call attention to 2 other books. One, Mary Cohan had this, brought this in, and it's a book by Rachel Ray, and I'm not sure, I just learned, but Rachel Ray's husband is from Horseheads. And so he's a part of this book too. So if you're into cooking and all of that kind of stuff, and drinking, then this is a book that you might be interested in. The third book that I want to mention, originally when Barb asked me about speaking here, I was going to speak on John Meacham's book, And There Was Light, about Lincoln. And this is excellent. So if you want to read about Lincoln, Meacham is great. Of course, he's written about Jackson and Jefferson and so on. But it's a wonderful book. So let me get into this.
Excuse me, Jim, for just a moment. For recording purposes,
okay.
for people who couldn't make it.
Gotcha.
I'm not going to go over everything I said, but now you can really hear me. I probably will be doing a little more reading in this than I should be, but I wanted to, this book is so interesting to me. And technology is not interesting to me.
Here, here.
I noticed that.
I'm not here.
Pretend you're not, okay. All right, first of all, I have a picture of Lincoln. And the reason, of course, he and Booth are the main characters in this book. And Lincoln was a melancholy person. And it's interesting that his favorite poem was titled Mortality by William Knox. "'Tis the wink of an eye, 'tis the draught of a breath, from the blossom of health to the paleness of death. From the gilded saloon of the bier and the shroud, oh, why should the spirit of mortal be proud?" That was his favorite poem. And Booth, this is what he is when he was age 14. Johnny Booth had been dealt a bad hand in life. Quite literally, if you believe the palm reader he consulted when he was barely a teenager. She said she'd never in her life seen a worse hand. He'd been born under an unlucky star, she told the 14-year-old. Staring at the crisscross lines of his hand, she saw sorrow and trouble everywhere she looked. He was jinxed. He'd be rich and generous with his money, but he'd have a thundering, by the way, when I got to Booth, I was going to have a picture of Booth. But he'd have a thundering crowd of enemies. His life would be grand, fast, and short. He'd meet a bad end. The words came from the mouth of a woman who read the fortunes in a wood. But Booth was young and impressionable when he heard them, and they haunted him for the rest of his life. I had the opportunity, my wife and I, to spend some time in Washington, D.C., where our son is and our newly born granddaughter has emerged. 13 or 14 days old, I should know the count exactly. While there, we went to Ford's Theater to see A Christmas Carol. And there is, there's Ford's Theater on 10th Street. And it's an interesting theater, and there'll be more to say about that. But the theater is not large, and there's not a bad seat in the house. And as we were there, while standing in the lobby, I met this gentleman. And of course, being a Bills fan myself, I was quite intrigued. But come to find out, he and his wife, who are originally from the Buffalo area, had been ushers at Ford's Theater for the last 20-some years. And it was interesting, and when we went inside, of course, he was there. And then we went into the lobby, or into the theater. There's the theater, which, as you see, is not very large. And this shot was taken from about where I was seated. And you can see the stage, which of course plays a prominent role. And you can see the box. And then just to show that we were there, there's the box. And then that's to show that we were there. So it can be authentic. The story of Lincoln's death is very interesting. Of course, Booth had planned kidnapping Lincoln prior to that, but his plan didn't work out. And so then he decided that this was his opportunity. Lincoln enjoyed going to the theater. We know that there had been good news. Lee had surrendered. He felt that it was, the opportune time. They invited General and Mrs. Grant. Some of you are aware that Mary Lincoln was not the easiest person to get along with, and Mrs. Grant vetoed going to the theater with the Lincolns. And they packed up and left town, and as they were driving their carriage out of town, they passed John Wilkes Booth. And the Lincolns invited Clara Harris and Major, I'm drawing a blank on his name. Major Rathbun. And they had been going out, they'd gone out a number of times before, and so they decided to go to the theater. During the course of the day, Booth was out and about doing things, and Lincoln was, of course, getting ready and sort of enjoying the day and relaxing a little bit. And then they went to the theater. And it's interesting that in the course of the day, Booth had run into John Matthews. And I want to read a section here about John Matthews because Booth gave him a letter. And what's interesting about this book is that a lot of the reading on Lincoln, like if you read Beecham's book, they talk about the shooting of Lincoln and what happened there, but you don't get to the characters behind the scenes. Like we know that eventually he goes to the Peterson house, which we'll talk a little bit about, but this book goes into who the Petersons were. And so the people that Booth contacted during the day. And this was an interesting situation. The owner of Brady's Gymnasium watched Booth pull his horse up to a curbstone about 4 p.m. and buttonholed his old friend John Matthews. Matthews had the same jet black hair and classic features as Booth, but none of the style and charisma that made heads swivel to watch Booth. The two actors met across the wide avenue from the gym, so Brady wasn't close enough to tell, but Matthews saw that Booth was visibly nervous and pale as a ghost. He asked the actor what was the matter. "Nothing, Johnny, nothing," Booth said, shaking atop the small horse. Matthews asked if Booth had seen the line of shackled Confederate prisoners that had just been led up the broken cobblestone avenue. Placing his hand on his forehead, the pasty-faced Booth said, "Great God, I no longer have a country." Then shifting both reins to his left hand, Booth leaned down over the horse's neck to his right and grasped Matthews' smaller hand tightly. Booth's hand was trembling, but he squeezed Matthews' hand so strongly that his nails left marks. He said, "Johnny, I wish to ask you a favor. Will you do it for me?"
Matthews would have done almost anything for Booth because the actor was generous and affable. In fact, Booth had helped Matthews go into acting.
Still, Matthews knew his best friend was, in his words, a little cracked in the upper story. Like many who had grown up on Baltimore's east side, Matthews figured insanity ran in the Booth family. Junius Sr. was always reputed to be cracked. Matthews would do most anything because months before, Booth had bugged him to join a numbskull plot to kidnap the president. Matthews flatly refused. The rebuff incensed Booth, who told actor Samuel Knapp Chester that Matthews was a coward who was not even fit to live. Booth even confided that he wouldn't care much if Matthews was sacrificed for the cause. As Matthew looked up at Booth on the mare, though he had no inkling that his old friend despised him. Anyway, this time Booth just wanted him to deliver a letter. Simple enough. Booth leaned down and handed Matthews a sealed envelope addressed to John E. Coyle, editor of the National Intelligencer. Matthews silently noted the oversized handwriting was identical to Booth's autograph on his publicity photos. His friend's handwriting was grand and impressive, not like Matthews' own hasty scrawl, with a letter T that looked more hastily drawn in ship's mast. So Matthews received the letter from Booth, which told the story of what he was going to do. Matthews did not read it, and later on, at his room in Peterson House, he opened the letter after the assassination and burned it. He was never brought to charges, but it was interesting that Booth wanted this because Booth, of course, thought he was doing his patriotic duty. Before I get into the assassination, though, I want to read another section, and then I'm going to hopefully not do too much more reading. Today we have the 24-hour news cycle, things happening all the time. We immediately see what happens if it's a shooting or anything like that. We see the reactions of the public. But when we read of Lincoln's assassination, we read about the theater, which disappeared again. We read about the theater, but we don't know what went on. And I want to read you, I'm going to jump ahead. This is the reaction about what went on. And excuse, this is a little longer, but I want to share it with you. Grover's National Theater had illuminated its Pennsylvania Avenue entrance mark to Union Victory. Two oversized transparencies shone in the light. The one on the left side of the doors read, April 1861, the cradle. On the right, April 1865, the grave. The signs had been hung to celebrate the birth and death of the Confederacy. But in a few hours, everything would change, and passers-by would view them as omens of evil. Inside Grover's audience members, many hoarse from cheering and singing all week, took their red, white, and blue programs and settled into their seats to watch Aladdin. The production was well underway when the theater doors banged open and a man shouted, "President Lincoln has been shot in his private box at Ford's. Turn out!" The audience, thrown into confusion, stirred until a calm voice called out, "Sit down. It's a ruse of the pickpockets." It was James Tanner, a War Department clerk, who had lost both his legs at the Second Battle of Bull Run. As the evening unfolded, the 21-year-old would play a key role in the assassination investigation, but for now, the crowd sat. The play went on. Few people noticed the man who whisked 12-year-old Tad Lincoln from the theater. Even fewer could hear the messenger who slipped around to Helen Moss's seat during a scene shift and whispered instructions from her brother-in-law, theater manager C.D. Hess. Quote, "Leave your seats quietly and stand by the back door. President Lincoln has been shot at Ford's Theater. Mr. Hess is going before the curtain to announce it and close the theater at once." Before the man walked off, he warned her, "Stand back lest there be a rush for the door." Moss couldn't believe her own ears. Just that afternoon, Mr. Lincoln had welcomed her and her sister-in-law, Julia Hess, to the Executive Mansion Conservancy. April 14, 1865 was a memorable day for Hess and Moss. They had shaken the hand of a wavy-haired actor, John Wilkes Booth, in front of Grover's. Then they had walked 2 blocks to the Executive Mansion where they had shaken President Lincoln's hand. The president, who knew Julia Hess's husband, had given the woman a tour of his conservancy where they breathed the mild bouquet of his prized lemon tree. Moss was wearing flowers from that tree as she hurried from her seat to Grover's back door. An acrobat was scheduled to tumble from a balloon to the stage sometime after 10:30. Instead, the balding 27-year-old theater manager stepped through the curtain. With the footlights shining on his stocky frame, Hess said he had a very grave announcement. Then he repeated the intruder's words. President Lincoln has been shot in his private box at Ford's. Excuse me. The house became still as death. Moss noticed so still that she was sure she could have heard a pin drop. Patrons seemed glued to their seats. Then the audience rose, almost as one body, dazed looks on their faces. Soldiers armed with bayonets were on hand in case the crowd rushed the exits. But there was no rush. Cheerless patrons silently filed out into Pennsylvania Avenue, Washington's widest commercial street. Illuminated for the war's end, it was so bright that you could see for blocks in either direction. The only sound was horses' hooves striking the cobblestone as the cavalry made for 10th Street and Ford's. James Tanner, on his wooden legs, headed 1 block over to Willard's Hotel to learn what he could. Fred Peterson tried to go home. Theatergoers, speaking in hushed tones, formed an impromptu procession headed for Ford's. And as soon as he could, the young manager, Hess, wired theater owner Leonard Grover at his New York hotel. President Lincoln shot tonight at Ford's Theater. Thank God it wasn't ours, C.D. Hess. As Fred ran east to his house directly across from Ford's Theater, the mood shifted. Word was filtered out from Willard's that Secretary of State William Seward's throat had been slit in his home. Men shouted that the rebels surrounded the city. "They have begun their raid," one cried. In the space of 2 blocks, as if someone had flipped a switch, a bewilderment became hysteria. As Fred rounded the corner to 10th Street, running as fast as he could, he heard some men yelling, "Hang him! Hang him!" He turned just in time to see a knot of rowdies crowded around a sycamore tree. They had caught hold of a poor man they had decided to string up. Fred pushed his way past them and ran uphill toward home. As he reached his block, he eyed one solid mass of men waving knives and revolvers and denouncing the assassins. Like Pearl Harbor in the 20th century and September 11th and the 21st, no one knew what would happen next. Word spread of the assassination of Seward, General U.S. Grant, Vice President Andrew Johnson, Secretary of War Edmund Stanton, and Chief Justice Solomon P. Chase. It would be daylight before anyone really knew who had been assassinated and who had been spared. The news passed from lip to lip that actor John Wilkes Booth was the president's shooter. Nonsensical. Everyone knew the president had come out to see Booth play in Richard III and the Marble Heart. The president had even asked to meet the actor. Few knew that Booth had purposely evaded meeting Lincoln. When Fred Peterson approached his curving brownstone porch, he found 2 soldiers blocking the door. "You can't go in," he said. "The president is lying there." "But I live here," Fred said, and he heard back, "No difference. You can't go in. I will see you. I can't go in." Then later on, he told Fred that, as Fred was in the house, he told Fred President Lincoln was lying in a small room above the kitchen and instructed him to see what he could do to help the doctors. As he neared the room, the boy's stomach turned. Bandages stained with President Lincoln's brain matter were already piled in the hallway. The stench took his breath away. The narrow bedroom was swollen with doctors, family, friends, members of the cabinet, and boarders enlisted to fetch hot water bottles. It was so jammed that Fred couldn't see more than an inch or 2 of the olive green and beige wallpaper with orange and mustard accents, except near the ceiling and behind the walnut bed where President Lincoln lay gasping on a corn husk mattress, topped with a softer cotton shoddy. The president's face looked ghastly in the dim gaslight. His rigid lips never parted, but his face twitched. His right hand, the one that had signed the Emancipation Proclamation, jerked involuntarily. The president's blood penetrated the feather pillows. His brain matter dotted the red, white, and blue Irish wool quilt. With each rise and fall of his chest, there issued a bleak, unforgettable moan. Senator Charles Sumner was sitting on the bed, holding the president's hand and sobbing like a child. The grim scene would have saddened anyone, but it jolted Fred and Ferguson. The boys knew something the sobbing cabinet members probably never imagined. They had both seen John Wilkes Booth lying on the same dark wood bed where Lincoln now lay unconscious. And they knew the assassin had cuddled up under the same quilt that now draped the dying president's nude body. Booth's convivial laughter had echoed through the small room, then just as the president's doleful moans did now. So I'm sorry to have read all of that, but it puts us right there. As I said, many of the accounts we hear of the shooting. And let's go back to the theater. Lincoln and Harris and Major Rathbun went to the theater. They went in, of course the play had already started, we're aware of that. And they went into their box. Now what's interesting, and if you read the other accounts, there was a guard with Lincoln. And you go into the door of the box, and then you go into there's like a little hallway, and then there's the box, and you go in the door, and there you are. There should have been a man stationed at the first door, but that man was not there. Now I've heard different accounts. One, that he had left and gone for a drink. One, that he couldn't see and had moved to another seat. She doesn't talk about that, but that's a mystery why he wasn't there. When Booth worked his way there, it's interesting that as he was going down the hall, one of the actresses on the stage saw him and he bowed to her. And then of course he goes into the box and he bolted the door, and then he goes in. Lincoln and Mary were seated side by side, Rathbun and Harris were off to the right, and Booth shoots Lincoln, drops the pistol. Rathbun jumps to defend Lincoln, who's already shot, is cut severely. Booth leaps from the box to the stage, and yells to the Six Semper Fidelis, I believe is what he said. Huh? Yeah, and says, and then off he runs, but he injured his leg and off the stage and panicked. There's a doctor, Dr. Leal, who sits close to the box, comes to the box and immediately starts treating Lincoln. And he's with Lincoln the rest of the time. And then ironically, when Garfield is shot years later, he's called as an advisor on how to treat Garfield. And they decide to move Lincoln across the street. There's the pistol. That is there's a museum at the theater. That's the actual pistol that was used to shoot Lincoln. This is the Peterson house across the street. Now sadly, we may have been in there many, many years ago. We did not
go in while we were down there this time, but this is the Peterson house. And this is the bed that both Booth and Lincoln were in, and this is Lincoln's deathbed. The account goes on about Lincoln, and of course Booth escapes. There were other assassination attempts, as people are aware. They did try to get Seward and broke into the house, and Seward was injured, but the assassin was fought off. They were going to assassinate the vice president, but the guy chose not to. And so the plot, all fell apart except for Lincoln. And Booth escaped, and they would eventually get him. If you go on, there's a couple of other accounts I wanted to share with you. This is Mr. Peterson, who owned the house, was not the most pleasant person. And he had left the house and was at his tailor shop. And then when he returned, of course, he was quite annoyed at what the situation was. And Fred Peterson found his father sound asleep in his tailor shop. Soon they were heading home on the wet, dry streets, a cold mist enveloping them as they walked. By the time they returned, Stanton had thrown open the death room windows to let in some fresh air. The president's face was cold as stone, and the blackness had spread beyond the eyes to the forehead. That wasn't what threw William Peterson off, though. When Peterson's eyes fell on the stinking piles of bloody bandages and leaking mustard plasters, he became unglued. The heaps of medical refuse loomed large in the narrow hallway. The boarding house owners stormed into the death room and rudely grabbed the stained top pillow out from under the dead president's head. Terrifying the Youngkie brothers, raising the thick window blinds, he tossed the pillow, possibly still wet with Mr. Lincoln's blood, out and onto the fieldstone courtyard 2 stories below. And then later, when his daughter was married, the pillowcases of those pillows were put in a safety deposit box. Because after Lincoln's assassination, making money of the remnants that were left was a pastime for many of those people. But then, as some of you may know, this man sent a bill to the government for $550 for using his house for Lincoln during this period. Yeah, he's a heck of a guy. I wanted to also lift up the Rathbons. The Rathbons, Clara Harris and Major Rathbun, it was, with Lincoln's case, Lincoln was killed, and Mary, if many are aware, suffered mental problems afterwards, and even for a time was put in an asylum. In the Rathbun case, it was the other way around. Clara was killed, and the Major lost his mind. Just like the Lincolns, one of the Rathbuns was killed by a madman, and the other was committed to an insane asylum. In the Rathbun's case, the husband was the madman. The couple was living in Germany with their 3 young children when Henry Rathbun shot and stabbed his 49-year-old wife just before Christmas 1883. Fully dressed before daylight, Rathbun wandered to the room where the children and their nurse were sleeping. He asked to see the children. Clara Harris Rathbun awakened and bravely distracted her husband, although he was armed with a new dagger and a new 6-shooter. Tricking him into leaving the children's room, she told the nurse to lock the door behind them. As soon as they were alone, he stabbed her in the heart, fired bullets into her breast, and then wounded himself. German police found a 6-shooter and a knife covered with gore. Rathbun told police his children had been abducted and he had been wounded in a fight with their kidnapper. His lawyers said the Major's mind was still clouded with scenes from Ford's Theater. It was like a scene that was never properly closed. The tragedy of Lincoln's death is monumental, really, when you think of all that was lost in terms of what could have been
if he had lived in terms of the healing of our nation. Certainly with the Rathbuns and the Peterson family and others, he suffered a great deal, and the nation suffered a great deal. In the aftermath of what happened, John Ford was not permitted to reopen his theater. He was paid $100,000 by the federal government and converted to a 3-story office building. In June 9, 1893, the theater collapsed and 22 people were killed. Congressman Henry Riggs Rathbun pushed for preservation. In 1931, the property was transferred to the National Park Service. In 1967, it was restored to 1865 appearance and reopened in 1968. The Peterson House was sold in 1878 for $4,500. The house was leased to a historical association that let Osborne H. Oldroyd stay rent-free. Quote, "the most remarkable instance of American hero worship on record. He spent 60 years collecting Lincoln stuff." The original Booth wanted poster, real logs split by Lincoln, lived in Lincoln's home in Springfield, and he had 3,000 relics. The federal government bought the house in 1896 for $38,000, and in 1933 it was turned over to the National Park Service. Of course, if you have the opportunity to go there, it's terrific. This book, and I probably could have done a much better job, but this book is really interesting because all of the minutiae, and you get lost in it doing a review, but it gives you a sense of what went on as if we were watching television and finding out the story. Now, we wouldn't get it from Fox, but we would get it from MSNBC. Oh no, I'm sorry. I couldn't resist it. So with that, I thank you for coming, and if there are any questions, I don't know whether there's enough of us here that we probably could give you an answer, so, George.
I just want to make a point. The banner in my book was with Seward when he was stabbed.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Oh.
It was given, taken to his house for safekeeping. It never
He was injured in bed, and the guy came in. Any others? Yes. Harry.
We went to Seward's house in Auburn, New York, and that's open to the public, but maybe 150 years after the Civil War, summer, they had a big celebration open to the public. You can still go in there, I believe.
Yeah, oh yeah, I've been there. It was interesting when
Furniture's still there.
the Auburn baseball plays, we used to play the Pioneers, and I attended a Pioneer game with the mayor of Auburn. And he invited me to a program at the Seward House, and at that time, our congressional district included Auburn. And Amo Houghton was our congressman, and he was very surprised to come up to the ceremony and find Jim Hare from Elmira standing there with the mayor of Auburn. So yeah, it's a great sight. And of course, Harriet Tubman is down the street. Yes.
Jim, does the book go into detail about the conspirators or the other ones besides?
It doesn't really go into detail about them. It mentions them, they're all included, and but it doesn't go into them.
Because one of them that was involved in kidnapping, John Surratt, was in Elmira at the time.
In fact, I did an article on him for the newspaper. That was his alibi, is that he was here. In fact, they have a picture of him in this book. So there's a picture of him.
One more thing. I ate in a restaurant, and I lived in Maryland for over 10 years. And early on, we ate at a restaurant on Shawan Road, which is south of Baltimore. We lived in a village, which I'm not sure, called Cockeysville. And the house was purported to be a former home of John Wilkes Booth on Shawan Road. Yeah.
Well, of course, with the assassination, Mary Surratt, John Surratt's mother, was executed. That was and Dr. Mudd, who was executed. I believe he's been pardoned.
He was pardoned.
Yeah, Mudd was pardoned.
Mary Surratt, she was hung.
Yes.
And she was the first woman.
Right.
First woman hung.
Yep.
What can you tell us about Mary Todd and the surviving Lincoln children immediately after the assassination? Like, how were they cared for? How long?
I cannot really. Is somebody comment? Can anybody comment on it? I don't know.
Robert
Well,
Todd, the older one.
Yeah,
Of course, he was under pressure because he had to keep track of Mary, and he's the one that had to
who
put
took,
Mary
who
in.
took Tad to the theater? Who took Tad to go?
I don't remember. I think it was said in here, but offhand, I don't remember the name. I didn't write it down, I just read
Wasn't
it.
there, didn't they have a bodyguard assigned to him by Pinkerton or something at that point?
Well, I'm sure that they put guards on him, but I don't have that, I don't know that. I better stop asking for questions. Yeah.
Just going to mention that I discovered last fall, there's a chair in the Masonic Temple in Montour Falls, and there's a plaque in the back. It said that chair was in Ford's Theater when Lincoln was assassinated.
Oh, really? Wow. So pilferage was a part of the things
Oh,
that
yeah,
happened after
people
that.
walk
As
up.
I said, well, and they were in the Peterson house. I mean, things that were laying on the floor, they were grabbing them up and then eventually would be selling them for relics.
Hey, Jim, doesn't Libs have a little square from the quilt on display?
Libs?
Libs, yeah.
I
Now
don't
they have
know.
stuff, you know, Joe Spaziani's and stuff out there. And I think one of the displays is, I believe, from the quilt.
Wow.
That covered Lincoln. It's
Oh,
just a
really?
little-
Okay. I'll have to-
Like maybe a half-inch square, you
Yeah.
know, but like you said, that stuff, eventually there was a market for it, and people
Oh.
sold it off as souvenirs.
It's something.
Yeah.
And, well, thank you.
Thank you so much, Jim. That was very interesting and it sounds like a very interesting book.
That's a good thing.
Thank you, thank you. So, next Friday will be Gary Emerson, who will be doing a book review. And next Friday, the book review will be The Shoemaker and the Tea Party by Alfred Young. So, hope to see you next Friday, 12 o'clock.